The children were facing one another across the pillar where the bell hung, still trembling, although it didn't give out any note. Suddenly, they heard a soft noise from the end of the room that was still undamaged. They turned as quick as lightning to see what it was. One of the robed figures, the furthest one of all, the woman whom Diggory had thought so beautiful, was rising from its chair. When she stood up, they realised that she was even taller than they had thought. And you could see at once, not only from her crown and her robes, but from the flash of her eyes and the curve of her lips, that she was a great queen. She looked around the room and saw the damage and saw the children, but you could not guess from her face what she thought of either, or whether she was surprised. She came forward in long, swift strides. "Who has awaked me? Who has broken the spell?" she asked. "I think it must have been me," said Diggory. "You?" said the Queen, laying her hand on his shoulder, a white, beautiful hand, but Diggory could feel that it was strong as steel pincers. "You? But you're only a child, a common child. Anyone can see at a glance that you have not a drop of royal or noble blood in your veins. How did you dare to enter this house?" "We've come from another world, by magic," said Polly, who thought it was high time the Queen took some notice of her as well as Diggory. "Is this true?" said the Queen, still looking at Diggory and not even giving Polly a glance. "Yes, it is," said he. The Queen put her other hand under his chin and forced it up so she could see his face better. Diggory tried to stare back, but he soon had to let his eyes drop. There was something about hers that overpowered him. After she'd studied him for well over a minute, she let go of his chin and said, "You are no magician. The mark of it is not on you. You must only be the servant of a magician. It is on another's magic that you have travelled here." It was my Uncle Andrew," said Diggory. At that moment, not in the room itself, but from somewhere very close, there came first a rumbling, then a creaking, then a roar of falling masonry, and the floor shook. "There is great peril here," said the Queen. "The whole palace is breaking up. If we're not out of it in a few minutes, we shall be buried under the ruin." She spoke as calmly as if she'd been mentioning the time of day. "Come," she added, and she held out a hand to each of the children. Polly, who was disliking the Queen and feeling rather sulky, would not let her hand be taken if she could have helped it. But the Queen spoke so calmly, her movements were as quick as thought. Before Polly knew what was happening, her left hand had been caught in a hand so much larger and stronger than her own that she could do nothing about it. "This is a terrible woman," thought Polly. "She's strong enough to break my arm with one twist, and now that she's got my left hand, I can't get at my yellow ring. If I tried to stretch across and get my right hand into my left pocket, I shouldn't be able to reach it before she asked me what I was doing. Whatever happens, we must not let her know about the rings. I do hope Diggory has the sense to keep his mouth shut. I wish I could get a word with him alone." The Queen led them out of the Hall of Images into a long corridor, and then through a whole maze of halls and stairs and courtyards. Again and again they heard parts of the great palace collapsing, sometimes quite close to them. At once, a huge arch came thundering down only a moment after they'd passed through it. The Queen was walking quickly. The children had to trot to keep up with her, but she showed no sign of fear. Diggory thought, "She's wonderfully brave and strong. She's what I call a queen. I do hope she's going to tell us the story of this place." She did tell them certain things as they went along. "That is the door to the dungeons," she would say, or "that passage leads to the principal torture chambers," or "this was the old banqueting hall where my great-grandfather bade 700 nobles to a feast and killed them all before they'd drunk their fill. They'd had rebellious thoughts." They came at last into a hall larger and loftier than any they'd yet seen. From its size and from the great doors at the far end, Diggory thought that now, at last, they must be coming to the main entrance. In this he was quite right. The doors were dead black, either ebony or some black metal which is not found in our world. They were fastened with great bars, most of them too high to reach and all too heavy to lift. He wondered how they would get out. The Queen let go of his hand and raised her arm. She drew herself up to her full height and stood rigid. Then she said something which they couldn't understand, but it sounded horrid, and made an action as if she were throwing something towards the doors. And those high and heavy doors trembled for a second as if they were made of silk, and then crumbled away till there was nothing left of them but a heap of dust on the threshold. Whew, whistled Diggory. Has your master magician, your uncle, power like mine? Asked the Queen, firmly seizing Diggory's hand again. But I shall know later. In the meantime, remember what you have seen. This is what happens to things and to people who stand in my way. Much more light than they'd yet seen in that country was pouring in through the now empty doorway. And when the Queen led them out through the door, they were not surprised to find themselves in the open air. The wind that blew in their face was cold and yet somehow stale. They were looking from a high terrace, and there was a great landscape before them. Low down and near the horizon hung a great red sun, far bigger than our sun. Diggory felt at once that it was also older than ours, a sun near the end of its life, weary of looking down on that world. To the left of the sun, and higher up, there was a single star, big and bright. Those were the only two things to be seen in the dark sky. They made such a dismal group. And on the earth, in every direction, as far as their eye could see, there spread a vast city in which there was no living thing to be seen. And all the temples and towers and palaces and pyramids and bridges cast long, disastrous-looking shadows in the light of that withering sun. Once a great river had flowed through the city, but the water had long since vanished, and it was now only a wide ditch of grey dust. Look well on that which no eyes will ever see again, said the Queen. Such was Charn, that great city, the city of the King of Kings, the wonder of the world, perhaps of all worlds. Does your uncle rule any city as great as this boy?